All right, and for our next talk, we have Cheryl Ng listed as our speaker. So yeah, I'd love to welcome Cheryl up on the stage from the UNICEF Office of Innovation. And we are a little bit ahead of schedule, so Cheryl, if you want to take an extra 10 minutes or open for Q&A, you're more than welcome. All right, let's give it up for Cheryl.
How's everyone doing today? Energy is low or high? So who knows what digital public goods are in this room? Okay, so we got a few. So I guess this is why I've been invited to talk here today. I'm Cheryl. I'm the Digital Public Goods Capacity Building Advisor at UNICEF's Office of Innovation. And your first question might be, why is UNICEF even here? Why are we in this space? Don't we support children who are living in poverty? But actually, UNICEF's mandate is to advocate for the protection of children's rights and to help meet their basic needs and to expand their opportunities to reach their full potential. And we're living in this world that is obviously technology rules our lives. And technology and digital solutions, they affect children's rights. They can be an instrument of power, and that power sometimes could not be used for good, it could be bad. And it must not be developed without young people's participation, because at the end of the day, they are the future. So who are we to also decide what their future is? And today, actually, on our team, I work under the UNICEF Ventures. We have a venture fund, and we actually have a crypto fund that invests in early stage frontier tech solutions that are solely open source and actually all from emerging markets. We are working on real world problems. It's not about how fast can I get my food delivered, or how do I minimize my scrolling time on social media. It's really working on access to quality education, access to health services, working on solutions that are doing cash transfers in humanitarian crises. And from all of this work that UNICEF Venture Fund has done, I got hired in 2021 to basically put together this digital public goods accelerator guide. And initially, it was basically to help startups, but particularly startup accelerators, innovation hubs, to support in designing digital public goods. But the biggest challenge, and I think I see it in the room here, is what the heck is digital public goods anyways? So why should we build for it? And I think we have to start from the very beginning and actually take a look back into history. So this picture here is from the Berlin Conference in the late 1800s. And at this time, the European countries only had influence on the west coast of Africa, or just on the coast. So 80% of this was still remained under traditional and local control. After this conference, it actually established partitions of Africa, and it became a playground for foreign countries and outsiders because they were extracting the mineral wealth. And that wealth wasn't for the Africans, which meant that the fate for the entire state was not left up to the African. And this is it now. It's capturing our human life. And it's a form of digital colonization. In a way, it's a social order that extends to extraction, but in new ways. It's extracting our data. It's extracting capacity of people, employment opportunities, and infrastructure. And while people will say colonialism was years ago, and it's not happening now, which, I tend to disagree, but to those we say, there could be no capitalism without the extraction of resources. So I guess in the context of Japan, we can take, let's say we have a guy who's in his 20s, his name is Mr. A, he's living in Tokyo. He's scrolling on Instagram for 3 hours a day. He's using YouTube Premium. He's using Line to chat with his friends. He's using Amazon Prime services to get things shipped. But none of these are made in Japan's services. So this situation, which is caused by a lack of domestic use of Japanese products, it's actually deepening the digital deficit, and this is why also it's depreciating the yen in the long run. Just in the past 5 months of 2024, the yen has depreciated 14% year over year because its digital imports have far outnumbered its exports. And this digital deficit, it's become a structural factor and change in the Japanese economy. So this is why we need to start building technology solutions that are for the people, built and maintained by the people and the public, and actually giving power to. It's not putting power over, so we're not relying on these big tech companies that are taking and extracting all of our resources. And now the question is, how can countries achieve digital sovereignty while having a functional infrastructure which is for the people? And this is where digital public goods come in. The official definition of digital public goods was actually coined in 2019, and that the technical definition is that it's open AI models, open software, open data, open content, open standards that adhere to privacy and other applicable laws and best practices. They do no harm and they help attain the UN Sustainable Development Goals. And this definition was, it came from the UN Secretary General's Roadmap to Digital Cooperation. So this is all new, but at least there's a set definition. Because when people talk about digital public infrastructure, there's no set term. And I think that's where there's a lot of debates around it. But this is set. There's a framework around it. And when we think of public goods, we all know it's non-competitive, non-rivalrous, and it has to be non-excludable, which means it's accessible to all. Not just all to use, but all to modify, reuse, adapt into any situation. And so there is this big, not so big, actually, now it's growing, but the Digital Public Goods Alliance, it's a multi-stakeholder initiative that was launched in 2019. UNICEF was a co-founding member of this, along with the German government, a think tank, and Norway. And now there's over 37 members that are not just of government or development organizations. GitHub is part of this, the government of Singapore, the government of Estonia as well. And just to say that if you go to the digitalpublicgoods.net, I believe, you can see there's a registry of already registered digital public goods that are spanning across the technology areas that we saw before, and also across the UN SDG goals as well. And for all of the businesses, I don't know if you were running businesses or working for a business, but the market for DPGs is estimated to be $100 billion by 2030. And this was from an EY report. And that number represents the opportunity for system integrators and for your business as well, in terms of those opportunities. So this is the DPG standard. This is a framework when we're thinking about for public goods. And of course, just to highlight here, that means that you're using an approved open licensing, but there's also good documentation and there's clear ownership. I think a lot of the issues around digital public infrastructure is that it lacks like who owns it and who is actually going to maintain it. And that's why having these specific indicators is crucial for that sustainability. It does best practices as well as privacy, security, and other components of doing no harm by design. And to go back to that slide for the people, when we think of open source could be used for commercial reasons, right? It could be used, big companies can build off of it and basically like take our data from this, which is happening now. But DPGs are actually built around a specific public challenge, and it has to be focused on the people. An example is, right now there is 2 billion people that are unbanked in the world. UNICEF Venture Fund, we invested in a company called Rumsun in actually I forgot the date, but this is in Nepal, and the solution is Rahat. It's a mobile-based blockchain token, basically to manage and monitor the aid transactions for emergency response and recovery programs, particularly usually when there's a natural disaster where marginalized communities don't have access to cash or they're affected. Each of these families, basically, they receive tokens or QR codes on their mobile phones to enable them to basically claim the cash from the municipality office. And the strategy was to use open source in the implementation so that the cost of the code itself is saved, and instead it's directly proportional to the operational expenses of actually running the blockchain-based platform and other services to make this mobile-based solution work, like SMS and integrated voice response system. And here, the biggest advantage is the real-time reconciliation data for central government of Nepal to actually see the transactions and transparency to all the key stakeholders. Okay, so digital public goods, they need to be built and maintained by the people, which is the open source ecosystem and beyond. So the open source ecosystem, it serves as the foundation for society's innovative strength, competitiveness, and democracy. And we often don't realize how much we actually depend on digital infrastructure until it stops working. I think the biggest example that we all saw was that when the Microsoft basically crashed because of CrowdStrike, it relied on CrowdStrike. 8.5 million Windows devices were actually, they basically experienced the blue screen of death. And that is basically where flights are being canceled, non-urgent surgeries were being delayed, medical visits were basically canceled, and probably a lot more that interrupted businesses. And it's a really stark reminder of digital monoculture when we rely on these big tech companies. And I like to say, like, yeah, when Microsoft sneezes, we catch a digital cold, essentially. Whereas in the case of Linux, open source software is built on transparency and collaboration. And I think the problem here is that too few people are actually testing the functionality and then returning the enhancements to the open source ecosystem to actually make this product even better. And that's, in the way it's not sustainable or functional. And again, this is why it's crucial to be building open source ecosystems. And the difference between just open source and DPGs here again is what kind of people, who is this ecosystem? When you're solving for a specific challenge in a particular area or city or whatever it is, the people are the beneficiaries. It's the government, the ministry that's around it. It's the development partners that are trying to build these communities to actually make this product better, where the open source ecosystem, they might not necessarily care about that specific issue. So you have to make sure that the values of whoever that open source ecosystem pertains to the actual product in order to continue to maintain it. Just a little bit of a fun fact, the supply side of open source software is actually an estimated $4.15 billion. And the demand side is valued at $8.8 trillion. And what that means is that there's these big companies and firms that actually rely on open source software. But there's a huge gap in terms of this supply. And in this case, this demand, only 5% of this is actually created by open source software developers, meaning that there's a huge opportunity for firms and developers to start creating open source and filling this demand for these not just large companies, but on that DPG market of $100 billion. So this means that there's that opportunity to build, but also to build capacity and demystify like open source in a way, because people think that, oh, if I open source it, I'm gonna lose money. And so this is for us at UNICEF. We invest, again, in the beginning, I mentioned we invest in early stage open source solutions, and particularly in the people that actually are living in those countries themselves, because they know the context the best. We're not outsourcing it to a bunch of McKinsey consultants or people that actually don't know what the context is. So UNICEF has invested in 81 startups across 37 countries, particularly in seed and growth funding. And 68% of our companies have actually been able to secure further funding from other investors, which is actually better than the average of the startups at this stage. And 7 of our companies have actually been acquired by other companies or have successfully exited as well with their open source solutions. So now we come to building digital public goods. It's about the power to and not power over. And I think we need to recenter the questions of digitization and sovereignty around power to. So we're asking those that are actually affected, like what do they need? It's not about how can I outsource a tech or find a tech company to basically build that software or already using an existing software from a big company, which is happening now. There's a lot of humanitarian organizations that don't really understand how technology works, and they think, okay, yeah, I trust Microsoft, I trust Amazon because they already know what they're doing. But at the same time, then they're locked in for years on years, and then who's going to maintain it? Where's the money coming from? And so it's not sustainable to be outsourcing these big tech companies, to be quite honest. And here, I think this is a big question. So what is the sustainability of DPGs? And I think when you're creating DPGs, it just starts as any business would. It starts by understanding the problem, of course, of what you're solving. A lot of companies, if they are thinking of, okay, if the government open sources or they're procuring open source solutions, why would I want to open source my product, right? And I think you need to think of these questions as a what if theory. So what if you build your business on software and share it under an open source license and somebody else uses it? What if someone actually uses it to make money? What if someone uses it and makes more money than me, or even like a huge grand sum of money with my open source software? Of course, as a business, you think that's not okay, but that's fundamental to how open source works. And if you don't have a business model that you believe will override any discomfort that they will cause you, then I suggest you not to open source your solution. The question is, how much do you actually care about the problem that you're trying to solve? And a really interesting, actually, example of this is a company we invested in called Statchwig. It's a supply chain and a blockchain-powered solution, basically, that tracks end-to-end products along a supply chain, basically solving the challenge that these stakeholders across the supply chain, they don't talk to each other. There's cold chain failures if they're trying to keep a temperature in a way, so they have to be able to track this across. And for them, they wanted to solve the problem, and their customers are for the government. It's for a development issue. There's an issue around it. But at the same time, they use their solution for a bigger corporate who needed their solution, which was AB InBev, to actually track like beer along a supply chain. But they found this open source solution. They could have implemented it, but they needed the expertise of this provider to actually be able to implement it. So that creation of their business, it didn't start off with, oh, I need to open source my solution because, you know, this company wants to procure it or there's a public call for procurement. There was a problem that needed to be solved at first. And this is why, and this is what we're actually trying to do, and I guess part of our team's job is really to build the capacity of stakeholders, including government, but primarily young people. Yeah, it's probably the most empowering thing to work on this, but we have Lebanon, which they have a social innovation program. There's an Accelerator program, UNICEF Startup Lab in Ghana, where we're working with entrepreneurs to basically develop digital public goods. And then there is, in Sierra Leone, they're actually going around schools to build the capacity around open source and digital public goods. Because again, these young people are going to be the future of the countries, and that they will be then maintaining all of these digital solutions. And so there can be no equitable digital transformation and digital public infrastructure without digital public goods. We must see the design and maintenance of public infrastructure as a public task. Because let's say in 25 years, the countries that we're working with, we're building the young people's capacity. For example, if we think of Sierra Leone, they're prioritizing having digital public goods in their digital public infrastructure. They want ownership of their infrastructure, of those products. They're right now building the capacity of young people around this so that they can be the maintainers of the future. And that they, at the end of the day, Sierra Leone will have a healthy, maintained digital public infrastructure system. Whereas in Japan, we have to ask ourselves, are they currently having an open source procurement for digital public goods in the public interest? Is there a co-development of open source software? Or is there a building capacity for stakeholders to understand the importance of how to build, maintain, and contribute to DPGs for DPI? And if not, then the country may be deepening in a digital deficit, locked in, facing the extractions of resources, capacity, and infrastructure by large tech companies, which then goes back to the history lesson of, well, what we call digital colonization instead of actually achieving digital sovereignty. Thank you.